Hey, do you remember playing all the level and fight-based DBZ games, but wish you had the option to explore the rest of the world outside those intense killer fights? Well, do I have the game for you! Kakarot is just what you're looking for. Exciting, riveting locales, new mechanics, and flashy sequences like walking with your son in the forest, fishing and feeding your son by the river, talking with your wife about your son, mixed with the breakneck story we all know and love, witnessing your son getting kidnapped in front of you, and sacrificing yourself and your god's planet to save your son. But who cares about that old tale? We've all heard it before. What'll really rope you in are the landscapes and blasting about the overworld, checking out cities and remote nooks to hide little secrets like orbs and But don't get too confused about it just yet. Those orbs and shit are used to enjoy the brand new RPG mechanics in an action arena spectacle fighting game. Look, this game seems a little confused about its priorities, and this part of the game is, to put it bluntly, asinine. Filler, if you would. Despite this, and the reason why this game is worth talking about, Kakarot makes some really interesting design choices to get the player to experience specific aspects of a TV show, something I think isn't explored very well in games derived from other mediums. Inside and out of combat try to convey this philosophy both to varying results, but how the combat is placed within the surrounding story and executed mechanically intricately resembles specific traits found in the show. This makes the player participate in an analogy of what that trait means in a video game. Outside of combat also resembles traits of the show that nobody asked for. This choice to adapt characteristics of the show into a mechanical form and prioritize which characteristics the player engages with, though, begs the question: in what way should the player be mechanically involved in the experience? Remember this question, it'll be important later. The bulk of the extra gameplay outside of the fights amounts to a commuting flight simulator while you're between missions. Not exactly an impressive amount of involvement. This technically is a facsimile of what you commonly see in the show. However, these systems are about as close to an out-of-combat analogy to the show as it gets. This bugs the shit out of me, specifically because the game's opening sequence seemingly promises more than it lets on, even on top of the fighting, only to pull the rug out hours in when you realize it never reiterates anything like this conveyed in the tutorial. It takes time away from the fighting to introduce a fishing mechanic, which implies more moments like it with similar mechanics could be coming. This isn't the case. There's only one other instance of different minigame mechanics, and fishing is never mandatory to progress the story. The ground controls in the beginning feel intuitive and free-flowing with a great sense of weight and finesse to get your movements just right, if not a bit like Mario 64. But Mario 64 was amazing, so don't hate. Yet, as soon as the game remembers that these characters can fly, ground mechanics outside of combat never come up again. There's no platforming to utilize the skill it might take to get somewhere interesting within the game world, especially if you could just fly there, and there's no reason to explicitly fight on the ground. This means that the environment doesn't have any design to it outside of looking canonical, housing random enemy encounters that get stale very quickly, and the mind-numbing side quests. But I'll get to those. Traversing the environment feels like a chore because there is no engaging use for it outside of commuting to your next objective. Which is intensely ironic because there's actual commuting mechanics in this game that are way more fun to play. It's all just lore-accurate set dressing for the busy work of doing dumb quests, flying around and picking up loot. That is, until it becomes lore-accurate set dressing for the fun part of the game, the fights. The scaffolding of an excellent world to play in is here, yet the time you don't spend fighting is spent flying over it all, while staring at your radar. Speaking of the radar, not to sound like H-bomb here, but this thing seriously dulls what could be, at the least, a minimally engaging experience of exploring the overworld. It turns into watching the top right corner of the screen all the time. A really easy way to get the player to engage with the overworld as it is, and not even have to change the mobility system, would be to remove the radar entirely. Maybe make it a small system for the Dragon Balls specifically, or just have the player use the sense key function that already exists. This doesn't add anything. In fact, it takes away from the visuals that are supposed to be the focus. If I'm being honest, what bugs me the most about the tutorial isn't the missed opportunities. It's that the radar eventually compounds the rest of the conveyance issues, exactly because there's no use for it in the opening. The primary gameplay loop for the whole game, helmed by the radar, is completely absent here. And so you're subconsciously pushed towards the visuals, and whatever mechanics you're given to toy around with. Whether it's intentional or not, why emphasize this stuff so much if it never matters? Why even have an overworld at all if your interactions with it are this uninspired? There's a reason very few DBZ games tried anything like this, because they knew the fights were a better use of playtime. Shh. Wait, you know what? Fuck it. Now's the perfect time to bring up... Say what you will about Budokai 2 and playing as a GPS navigator for your characters, but at least you are the strategist and mechanism for getting to the fights instead of just flying over to them. Let's be clear, it is in no way ludonarratively related to what the real gameplay and story is, yet it's still engaging. It enhances the experience of fighting against an active opponent on a battlefield you both have to navigate. This is way more involved than just running into or away from a floating enemy somewhere in your vicinity. Both in and out of a fight, the board mechanics, that are in no way related, still provide an opportunity for strategy and nuance that is related. These are mechanics that otherwise feel like busy work to get to the important bits, even when you do have other players on the field vying for the same things you are. This results in both proactivity and reactivity, as the player isn't the only one making these strategic moves. It adds a significant layer to the gameplay and even some personality to those you go up against. This charm would just be lost if you had the option to fly over a bunch of the unused terrain and easily avoidable fights, straight to your opponent standing there waiting for you to start the next sequence. Them waiting for you isn't adding any agency of value here, just tedium. Kakarot even knows this is the case with this system and will warp you to the end of the side quest so you don't waste even more time needlessly flying through an open world with nothing to do in it. Ironically, missing out on an opportunity to put interesting and reactive events on your way back. Now, would it make sense for these characters to have to walk, run, or jump in order to get around when they can fly? Not really. Could you, as a game designer, find ways of making this part of the gameplay loop without that question hovering above the players? Well, the developers did exactly this. In one instance on Namek, the crew needed to keep their presence a secret, and you are unable to fly to get to your next mission. And in the developers' vast design wisdom, it was no different than flying. Enemies that spot you start a fight just like normal, there are zero consequences for getting caught, and there are no new level elements, mechanics, or challenges born from a lack of flight. I understand allowing flight more often than not in order to maintain fidelity to the original story, but is this a missed opportunity? I think so. This sucks, but only because the way this actually pretty fun movement system was introduced at the start of the game. Instead of creating and presenting a poorly implemented system like this, why not start the story and the gameplay with Goku getting his shit rocked by Raditz, and just don't bother with the rest of this until you've made it clear that fighting is what the experience is about. Don't follow up the tutorial fight with a lush environment to explore with your son alongside genuinely enjoyable mobility mechanics, only to never build anything for these mechanics to engage with. What is immensely comedic is that one of the characters in the game makes this exact point for me.
If we fly, we should arrive in a matter of minutes.
I know, right? Traveling on foot is a complete waste of time when you're capable of flying.
You're such a whiner. It's gonna be more fun this way.
You know what? You can be a real pain in the neck, 17.
As if the developers themselves knew I would agree, insisted on doing it the bad way anyway, just to spite me. The indifference towards the ground mobility system feels like a microcosm for the rest of the game outside of combat. It's a token effort to make it feel like there's more to do than there really is. Like I said, outside of a few examples where something does happen on your way back to turn in a side mission, you're simply teleported back to save time. This is minor, but has the hilariously unintended side effect of letting the player know exactly when a twist is coming. Otherwise, you'd be teleported out. I don't remember a single point when a genuine unforeseen twist actually does happen in one of these. But to be fair, when what you're doing is so unengaging, I may have missed it. What praise! It was so boring I might have missed the good part. Most of the side missions offer nothing of value, like fetch quests for items, and a simple random encounter-esque fight to save a bystander, or trading mission straight out of Zelda. Yet, strangely, there are a few that are genuinely substantial uses of the creative freedom afforded to the developers by the filler in the show. Missions like Vegeta fetching items to create the gravity chamber don't make sense, but the driving missions for Goku and Piccolo provide a fun difference in tone and introduce some needed variety into the gameplay by the time you get there. At least, these sound like optional side missions, right? Turns out these are both mandatory and technically part of the main mission, although they have nothing to do with the overarching story of the chapter, existing solely to convey ultimately useless systems to the player. But still, the driving minigame introduces new mechanics just as fighting and flying are starting to feel repetitive. It also adds to the narrative, just like in the show, unlike the busy work of the actual side quests that never seem to be related to what you're supposed to be doing. Aside from these two very specific sets of characters that make their only story-related appearance in the very last scene. This is a side note, but not everything about the overworld is bad. I really like how you can enter the map screen by flying straight up from wherever you are. It's a small but effective way to remind the player that they're navigating an actual world, not just individual levels that have been stitched together. I can actually tell that's the impression that the developers wanted to impart because of it. Too bad it's completely overwritten by a much easier, faster, and less fun method of pressing two buttons to pull up the same map screen. Kachin's use in the overworld also feels like it was shot in the foot. In the games I've played before, it's been this rare substance made out to be one of the strongest in the universe. Attaching the purity and strength of it to a level-based obstacle is fine, smart even. However, placing it to only house functionally useless materials is an infuriatingly benign exploration of this concept. Anything could have been behind it. Hell, you could have even housed new areas that you look forward to going to, a la Metroidvanias. The Game Boy Advanced game Boo's Fury did this in its tutorial, and that was released in 2004. Instead, we get simple caves filled with dumb items. Kakarot is quite possibly the strangest amalgamation of someone's desire to show all of the entertaining and sedative elements of the DBZ universe, placing half-baked designs and underutilized mechanics right alongside one of the greatest gameplay facsimiles of what we're really here to see. Geniusly, the combat in Kakarot is often analogous to the quickest parts of the fights in the show. The snappy bits where the characters are flashing around each other for an impactful blow, or appear in a blur trading strikes. Even better, although it plays a minor role, when you power up right before you reach your high-intensity form, you'll gain what fighting games like to call super armor, giving the player immense stagger resistance, resembling those moments in the show when a character tries and fails to stop someone from transforming. Sure, the enemies get this too, but it feels different when the player gets the same treatment. The reactive and proactive combat of dodging, flashing, and timing power-ups feels great to get a handle on, and as a bonus, it looks cool as hell, just like in the show. Even more fascinating are the team-ups. While they can look flashy and cool, you can actually call on a teammate to make a decisive attack, even when you are unable to move, and intercept an oncoming enemy. I figured this out right before you literally watch the same thing happen in a cutscene. It's just, chef's kiss. Perfection. I loved this. Now, you might say, Aaron, basically every DBZ game has some of these mechanics. What makes Kakarot so special? The answer is that this quite stupendous placement and pacing of the combat represents the moments after a lot of the exposition and dialogue in the show, but before any of the most flashy, memorable parts. Remember this this will be important, but it's specifically trying to replicate the blur in combat moments from the show. In a vacuum, this is really cool to realize. To my great delight, though, some of the dialogue does make it into the fights as well, and this massively improves the engagement, contributing to the feeling of the situation unfolding while you're still in it. I would have liked the dialogue to have been more reactive and less expositive in general, but I'll take what I can get. Vegeta mentioning that you haven't used anything close to the Kaioken spine snapper you used on Nappa is fantastic, especially if you actually hadn't used it. I'm not sure if he says this if you had, but it worked out for me, so yeah. But I wish they took it a step even further with minor dialogue changes or additions of the characters reacting to the differences from the canon events. I'm not asking for any alternative realities or anything yet, just something like Vegeta being a little more emotionally destroyed that Goku may have only needed the Kaioken for the beam struggle and not just to keep up. That's all. Hell, in that case, it doesn't even need to be spoken. In fact, it definitely doesn't. Combat does include some special bits and flashy moves, but in this analogy, it's chalked up to just being visual fodder to move the battle forward and not necessarily representative of their use in the show, which is the show uses these moments to represent an advantage, or resilience, or a decisive move, and that's exactly how it's shown in the game. All in all, I think this system, as is, works pretty well in aiming for fidelity to the show. It feels about halfway to its theoretical peak, but the bones of a really fun and challenging gameplay system that intelligently manifests some of the best aspects of the show are in here. The paradigm is only slightly undercut in practice by the much easier design-destroying dominant strategy of spamming special moves, positively crushing the intended use case and difficulty into a Yamcha-shaped hole in the ground. If you want to enjoy how abrasive this experience can be, you kind of have to limit how much you use certain special moves. Otherwise, it turns into a much less engaging game of finding a few moments to charge ki and blasting your opponent into the sun over and over. It's a genuine shame there's no mechanic that prevents you from doing this to force players to utilize and get better at the rest of the combat systems, because just using ki as a limiter isn't doing the job. Some enemies are decent at countering this, but not all of them. I can't really think of an in-universe explanation-inspired mechanic that would do it justice, outside of reworking how ki has functioned in these games for decades. Now, remember what I said about the combat taking place before any of the most flashy memorable parts? Kakarot relegates them to a nice little cutscene that one-to-one mirrors the show, and, while beautiful, commits the cardinal gaming sin of not letting the player do the cool stuff. The beam struggle from the Saiyan saga, Trunks cutting Frieza into bits, destroying Nappa's spine. You get to walk around as a crying child, but don't get to run away from the dinosaur. The beam struggle specifically doesn't make sense because there's a beam struggle mechanic. Like, why not let the player do this after you already put in the work to implement this system? This shit is hard enough to try and pull off. I mean, look at how many attempts this took. Watching these moments again in 3D is pretty cool. But do you know what would be even more cool? Being able to play these moments in 3D. Even the father-son Kamehameha is just another cutscene. An atrociously long one, I might add. I have a lot of gripes with this choice. One of the highest is that these sequences were designed to be the emotional peak of a TV show. And you really feel that in a video game format. Waiting nearly 4 whole goddamn minutes for a reason to pick your controller back up. That genuinely might be longer than your actual fight with some of these characters. I still teared up at Goku placing his hand on his son's shoulder though, so it's not all bad, I guess. It gets seriously tedious when you put the flying and the cutscenes into perspective. I played the first 3 sagas 3 separate times, and the one where I didn't skip anything, there was more of cutscene and flying than there was actually playing the game. What I find most confusing is that all of these moments are animation clips instead of being worked into the fights. When conditions, maybe possible win scenarios would work, yet the devs decided to completely remove any engagement with the most impactful parts of the story. At the very least, making them as possible outcomes gives the player a chance to participate in what actually resolves the story. Why not put the agency back into the player's hands, where when you happen to end the fight with a certain move or combo, you are mechanically responsible for how it was going to be portrayed anyway. The closest the game comes to this is flashy executions, super finishers, which, while nice and different, is even more of a compromise than win scenarios since it can't happen in a fight with one of these cutscenes. To be clear, I don't mean alternative realities like in the newer games, just that ending the fight with a particular method, combo, or move means participating in the story in a way that isn't possible as it sits currently. So, with this in mind, I think a more appropriate question is, in what way should the player be involved in the most important moments of the experience? I'd argue that for the majority of all games, direct mechanical input from the player means the most narrative engagement. There are exceptions to this if you specifically design for that kind of subversive experience, but in a fighting game, this is almost never the case. You want to be able to do the thing. You pulled off doing the thing, you beat the thing, you won the game. You didn't just reach a minimum threshold and now you get to watch your character win afterwards. You did the thing. You beat the game. You want to know how I know this is the case for Kakarot? In a few fights, they did this. In the first fight with Vegeta, he starts a Gallic gun, and you have the option to wait for him to charge up and dodge it, or you can beat down a meter that gives you a neat little cutscene and a shit ton of free damage. Hey guys, great stuff here, but do this for the important bits, not just some reference to the show you wanted to sneak in. They had the time and budget to record multiple variations of the same line and animate reactions to dialogue trees for an in-character quiz. Not once, but twice. But I couldn't be the one mashing a button to kill the bad guy. This is one of the ultimate utilizations of the medium. To place the player into the story, into the role of the character, through the mechanical actions that you have access to and choose to employ. It can be done well, and it can be done poorly, but the fact that it happens at all is part of the story being told through the gameplay. In Kakarot, to not have the option to win or lose at the moment in which it mechanically and narratively means everything is a massive missed opportunity to involve the player in the story. Instead, they opt for just one while the other is split apart. At a certain point, I began to disassociate the peaks of the gameplay from the peaks of the story, even though they happened right next to each other. As a developer, how could you not be constantly asking, what on earth is going to resonate as memorable when the best parts of the most intense moments are mechanically inaccessible? Would you rather your players remember the time they scraped their way to their own hard-won victory, and then they watched their character do something they could have easily pulled off? There's an immediate loss of immersion when you feel the adrenaline from finally ending a tough fight like a badass wash away into seeing your character doing something that looks even cooler without you. That's what I thought until I played through the end of the Boo saga. I felt left out of the coolest looking parts, and to some extent I still feel that way. But during the last fight, I realized this missed opportunity isn't what the game was about. It was always about getting to experience the fastest parts for yourself. At the very last moment, I realized the decision to emphasize the fastest parts of combat is what the developers were building to the whole time. And the final fight with Kid Buu is what gives this choice its zenith. The setup is manufactured from a canon perspective, but the setup is exactly the same as every fight we've seen before. That's not lazy, and that's not a mistake. Goku is about to get blown to bits while trying to launch the Spirit Bomb and needs to fight Kid Buu one last time to create an opening in order to get a clean shot. It's the final bout. Time literally stands still, it's happening so fast. To enhance the feeling of adrenaline, Goku is in overdrive the whole fight without a timer on it. What's more, you spent the whole game doing a delicate dance of timing attack animations to find and exploit openings. Instead of the logical next step of the strictest dance, you're unshackled. You can attack through the pain, desperate for the win. You're trading blows at the same time even, something that doesn't happen anywhere else in the game. These 3 deliberate choices to relinquish the limits of combat are the direct mechanical analogy of what Goku is going through in the story. The important thing here is that games can offer more to experiencing these stories than just watching them play out in a cutscene. Kakarot adds to the layers of the experience through these specific design choices. This is what I needed to experience to understand the intent behind the analogy. The developers were making the fights the most important parts. I only needed to trust that this choice had a purpose, and that its sweet, sweet payoff was coming. They were conditioning you in every fight to play within the boundaries of your enemy, and now those boundaries have disappeared, precisely when, and only when, the story demanded it the most. It's hard to put into words how engaging and exciting that feeling this difference really is. 30 hours of waiting for a moment to attack turns into, I have nothing to wait for. It's now or never. Man, what an incredible and rare dynamic. I can literally think of only one other game that does this well. I hope that bit about the other adapted games didn't throw you off. I actually really like Fallen Order in the same way. You spend the whole game wondering why you're not able to do the coolest stuff this universe has to offer, only to eventually, intimately understand why the developers chose to put you through it. So experiencing the ending is 10 times as powerful. Would a player maybe want to be the one pushing against Boo in the final cutscene? Sure, but I genuinely cannot fault the developers for stubbornly sticking to their combat design the whole way through, while finding just the right moments to place the fights and giving the overarching experience of that choice a truly proper endgame send-off. What a game. What a fight this was. The payoff for the system they wanted us to experience is commendable all on its own. Being the driving factor for the flashy bits wasn't what they were going for. It is expensive to design around that kind of engagement anyway, let alone execute it. The point was also to recreate the show down to the exact details. They chose to take a part of the show that they knew they could adapt well within the goal of fidelity, aiming for a rigid kind of fidelity to the source material rather than adapting it into the medium, especially at this scope, is inherently limiting their design. An especially cruel limitation, exactly because they did so well in adapting a major part of the show in a very unique way. But just because it wasn't as good as it could have been doesn't mean that what we got isn't valuable. Sure, what could have been sounds amazing, but the system that is here, and the way it was integrated into the story they needed to stick to, is still proof that if you make the choice to place limits on your players, and integrate those limits into the story, you can still create a gameplay experience that embodies what it meant to go through that story. And the payoff can still be worth the whole experience. This one may only work at its best when players intentionally restrict themselves, but still. Right, sorry to pull another twist out at the end, but the whole experience I described hinges on not exploiting the systems within easy reach of the player. The challenge of combat is what gives this system its edge, its bite. Mitigation of the difficulty that creates this challenge is something Kakarot has a hard time with. I briefly mentioned it before, but spamming special moves isn't the only way to breeze through these fights. Overleveling through side quests is very easy, even if it is tedious, and it turns the gameplay structure into a power fantasy when it actually works best with the story through player skill and adaptation. Figuring out what to do in response to an attack you just don't have the health to tank, or learning just how many mistakes you can afford to make in a fight massively contributes to the difficulty. Limits like how much ki an attack takes, blocking capacity, and mobility restrictions force the player to learn their opponent in order to get enough of an edge to win. It creates a specific kind of difficulty that emphasizes a player's ability to recognize these limits and risks, to play around them to overcome a fight. You should have to do this if the experience is about the difficulty of the challenge. All of these aspects are thrown out the window if you're a much higher level. Not only do you have more health than you should, but enemy attacks do less damage as well. This, in tandem with the spamming specials, would be enough on its own to throw off the balance, but you also have access to senzu beans. These are infinitely replenished if you wait long enough, and they fully restore your health in battle instantly. Look, I understand the need to ensure that anyone could make it through your game, but these systems also ensure that any decent player will need to resist using them, so they can fully experience the story through the gameplay. There's also subsystems that are aimed at making the game easier, like the RPG mechanics. These, weirdly, increase certain battle stats at the same time enemies are getting stronger, so you don't really feel a difference. The only difference I actually noticed were the lateral progressions of adding more strikes to your attack combo, which feels amazing compared to the vertical progression of the stats. The vertical progression here is in stark opposition to an alternative where the player would have to figure out how to overcome stronger enemies through skill instead of stats, which sounds way more compelling from both a story and gameplay perspective, even if it would make the game less accessible. I've always found accessibility systems like this to just be lazy, and that's not even touching the scourge that is difficulty sliders. A pretty easy way to make the game accessible but also maintain the optimal level of challenge is to restrict which systems are even available. Depending on the difficulty level, you have the player set anyway. A more in-depth version would entail altering how the systems operate at a given difficulty level. Easier settings can add in the sensu beans or alter blocking capacity to aid the player more. Simply put, there are better options than what's here. If the point was difficulty through limitations, in order to experience the euphoria of removing those limits in the final fight, then there shouldn't be easy access to systems that mitigate the difficulty. So, that's the bulk of my analysis, and my argument as to why I think this game should be discussed, especially in regards to adapted media. But the rest of this is for those of you wondering what we can really learn from this. Shout out to my game dev viewers. But first, some nitpicks. The game clearly front-loaded its development allocation. By the time you get to the Cell Saga, there's an obvious lack of polish in all but the most significant cutscenes.
I feel a lot better now.
Hey, what's that?
Hey, I guess that settles it then.
Characters awkwardly changing positions, the narrator summarizes an interaction or event that would have been, at the very least, interesting to watch. Iconic moments are just missing. Lines being cut off towards the end of their delivery.
What do you think that you could possibly accomplish in just one day? Leaving so soon? I don't think...
Hell, there's even some classic, I'll just pan up for now, we'll add that in later, moments that they never went back to fill in. I'm sure I'm missing some, and it's not that important. I just noticed that they would rather make new paywalled DLC than polish up what they already have. Hilariously, very few moments in the entire game are lip-synced correctly.
As for the lack of response from the Ginyu Force, I suppose I have you to blame.
Except for those special cutscenes where the characters start suddenly emoting like crazy out of nowhere. It is funny in a vacuum, but I'd imagine it's quite frustrating if you paid full price for this experience. I did really end up liking the music in this game, and most of the way through I realized why. Just listen to these tracks and tell me what you hear. Pretty similar, right? I wonder if that was intentional. Last minor point, but it means a lot to me. The narration absolutely ruins certain parts of the emotional through line. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think I would have ever noticed if it weren't for a certain video on director's cuts, but there's a moment where Vegeta breaks down in front of Frieza. You get to imagine for yourself the humiliation and significance of his failure to match up, dragging Vegeta to tears in front of everyone he's threatened with the power from which he gets so much of his ego. Except you don't get to imagine, you get a narration about how bad he feels, completely sucking out all the emotional tension. This doesn't really have anything to do with the thesis of this video, it just bothered me enough to make it in. Alright, now the stuff we can learn from this. I understand that a direct control design wasn't what Kakarot was going for, but if your aim is to push the boundaries of the medium, don't design for a lack of engagement. Kakarot's placement and style of fighting mechanics are engaging on their own, but become deeply engaging when the story highlights them. The flying and especially the ground mechanics, in contrast, could have been very involving as they are, if they were placed in an environment that engaged with those systems. The lack of any engagement during the important bits combines with the lack of valuable, yet forced engagement in traversing the world to create an experience that is, at face value, confused about what the player should be focusing on, in terms of how much time you have to allocate with which systems. I mean, it took me until the very last fight to realize that the way the fights were set up were the flashy important bits the whole time. The last point I want to make is, if your aim is to entertain rather than challenge, consider why you're making this experience, specifically one sold on its difficulty, in a medium about a participant's ability to engage with that material. I know you might be saying, hey, what do you mean? These fights are totally challenging. It's like the Dark Souls of DBZ. Difficulty is a large part of the experience, for sure, but to challenge a player is to create an experience integrating difficulty into the story, and it's about the story you want the player to feel through the way that difficulty is implemented. This inherently means no mitigations, few workarounds. Otherwise, it's not about the challenge, it's about something else that's kinda difficult to get to. You should strive to make a player internally and mechanically contend with what it means to exist as their character does. To contend with why it is difficult, and why they can't make it easier. They can only learn to overcome with the options they have. In this light, we can determine that Kakarot's difficulty is superficial, not challenging, just hard. To those of you who feel this isn't the case, tell me how you think the difficulty is integrated into the story, and not just, that's the game, or it wouldn't be fun if it were easier. I want you to ponder on utilizing difficulty of progression as a substitute for the challenge of an experience before you answer. There is a difference in how the specific function that creates difficulty is related to the story, if it's even related at all. I think it's clear that Kakarot prioritized adapting a specific aspect of Dragon Ball Z into a gameplay style that could reach the peak that it did, and secondarily prioritized the difficulty as a tool of retention, without really figuring out how to integrate the two. That they wanted difficulty to augment the experience, not exemplify it. If they did want it to represent the story their players should feel through their controllers as much as their hearts, if they wanted the player submerged in this difficulty instead of just observing it, then why are there so many ways to easily get around it? Thanks for sticking around if you made it this far. I'm already blown away at the support I received for my Fallout analysis, so rest assured another one about Fallout 2 and 3 are coming. In the meantime, I've got some interesting thoughts on Dead Island, so join me next time for another shorter video like this one. Thanks again. I'll see you around.